Hi, welcome to my Mechagon Workshop guide. In this guide, I'll be breaking down all the abilities of all enemies you will face in a typical route in this dungeon. I'll be uploading the VODs seen in the video separately if you wish to see those. There isn't really a route to be talked to in Mechagon Workshop, so I won't be making a video on that. Just like with my previous guides, I'll be marking important or impactful mob abilities in red, and non-important or low damaging abilities in green. Additionally, I'll also mark abilities that can be interrupted with the interrupt icon. Workshop is a relatively linear dungeon that features some difficult bosses. This dungeon in particular is very difficult in tyrannical weeks, so beware. Without further ado, let's begin. You start the dungeon with one pack before the first boss. In an arena are 6 robots and 1 mechanic that turns into a Nethrazine. The room itself is quite dangerous. Occasionally, saws pop out of the ground and start spinning around the room. Their hitbox is massive, and they feel considerably larger than they appear to be. You want to try to avoid these as they knock you back and deal damage. As for the mobs themselves, the first of these robots is the Bomb Tonk. It has one very important interrupt in the ability Detonate. If you let this go off, it deals damage to the entire party. Interrupt this to reduce incoming group damage. After that is the Strider Tonk. It only has one ability, Flying Peck, where it jumps to a random player after a 2-second cast. You'll just want to sidestep this jump. And finally, and most importantly, is the Rocket Tonk. It casts Rocket Barrage, unleashing several rockets in the direction of players. They deal good damage. The catch here is that these rockets also damage your enemies. If you can help it, have your enemies stack up in these rocket impacts. As a matter of fact, in high keys, sometimes the tanks go in alone and defeat this pack alone, doing damage mostly through rockets. If you do this strategy, make sure your party stands far back and doesn't enter the arena, as the rockets have a significant range. If done correctly, all rockets will land near the tank, and the tank should be able to AoE down the pack quickly. After defeating the pack, you face the first boss. Though you've defeated the trash, the saw blades will still spin around the room, so beware of this. The first boss fight is a 2-man fight involving a Platinum Pummeler and the Gnomercy for you. Let's talk about the Gnomercy for you first, which I'll refer to as the tank boss for the rest of the video. The tank boss begins the fight by casting Maximum Thrust, where they target a random player and charge towards them. This can be easily sidestepped. Once the player is selected, you can move. When the tank hits a wall, it's rattled and stunned for 10 seconds. You'll want to face this to a nearby wall so he doesn't run away too far. The bomb tank then tries to get within melee range of the enemy that has the highest threat against it, like a normal mob. However, it doesn't actually melee, so if the tank doesn't have aggro, it's not really an issue. The tank boss also casts Vent Jets, selecting a player and beginning to breathe fire in all directions except behind it. That selected player must run as far away from the tank boss as possible to avoid the flames as the tank boss begins to chase them. Everyone else should also avoid being in melee or remain behind the boss at all times. Note that even if you aren't touching the flames, everyone will still take unavoidable damage, so brace for damage and possibly use a defensive. After finishing Vent Jets, the tank boss is also rattled, getting stunned for 10 seconds. And that's all for the tank boss. As for the Platinum Pummeler, the Platinum Pummeler starts the fight covered in 3 layers of platinum plating. Each layer grants the Pummeler a 33% damage taken reduction. At 3 stacks, this effectively means that he's immune to damage. By now you would have noticed the 4 hammers around the room. Each hammer can be used to slam on the Pummeler to remove 1 stack of this plating. Note that if the hammer successfully removes a plate, the hammer breaks and you'll have to move on to the next one. Be patient, as the hammers can take some time to drop sometimes. Tanks should guide the Pummeler to 3 of the 4 hammers around the room. For each plate removed, the boss also gains 1 stack of removed plating, increasing their movement speed. The first part of the fight involves the rest of the party dealing with the tank boss, and the tank dealing with the Pummeler boss. Once the tank has removed all 3 layers from the Pummeler, the tank brings the Pummeler to the tank boss, and you AoE them down together with Lust. The Pummeler also casts Lay Mines, frequently leaving mines strewn across the field. You'll want to avoid these. Finally, the Pummeler occasionally casts Whirling Edge, dealing damage and a small AoE around it for a few seconds. Step out of melee when he does this. And that's all there is to the fight. I recommend killing the tank boss first, as most of the damage in this fight comes from Vent Jets. The sooner that is removed, the easier the fight. Most groups opt to use Lust after the Pummeler has all its stacks removed and is brought back next to the tank boss. You're then sent down the trash hole and you must make your way out. The first mob you encounter here is the Waste Processing Unit. It's a rather simple mob. Its first ability is Process Waste, where it targets a random player, and then it begins channeling a forward funnel, dealing continuous significant damage to players in front of it. You want to sidestep this. The Waste Processing Unit also has Mega Drill, dealing lethal damage to players within 10 yards after a 4-second cast. You'll want to step out of this. Normally, pulling 2 of these mobs together is not a bad idea, as most of their incoming damage is easily avoidable. After those 2, you'll face a few packs, primarily consisting of Living Waste. These bad boys don't have too much health, but upon reaching 0 health, instead of dying, they cast Volatile Waste. After 1.5 seconds, they explode, dealing significant damage to anyone within line of sight. The idea here is to burn them down quickly, and as they're casting Volatile Waste, hide behind some objects to get out of line of sight. The first slime pack you hide to the left here by this metal thing. Other packs in the future you'll be hiding behind these pillars. The second pack of slimes also has a Junkyard Dog. These aren't very threatening, only really casting 2 abilities. The first is Metallic Jaws, biting down on the tank, dealing some damage. Their other ability is Flaming Refuse, where they apply a magic debuff to a player, dealing some damage over 8 seconds. Healers dispel this. This dog in particular can be dangerous on bolstering weeks, where the slimes bolster the dog. And the last pack before the boss consists of a dog and the mini-boss from the Affix. You then meet the second boss, K.U J.O. K.U J.O is also a simple boss, but has a lot of outgoing damage in the fight, so be careful. K.U J.O normally starts the fight by casting Airdrop, dropping a large box on a player. You'll want to sidestep this, as it can deal a fair amount of damage. K.U J.O will then eventually cast Venting Flames, dealing significant damage to all players within line of sight. You'll want to use that box earlier and hide behind it. Hiding behind it puts you out of line of sight of K.U J.O, so you can survive Venting Flames. The boss will only ever drop 1 box for every cast of Venting Flames. After casting Venting Flames, the box will turn red, signifying that it is unsafe to stand behind. The boss also casts Explosive Leap, jumping on up to 4 players, each marked with a red arrow. It deals damage to you and any player within 10 yards of you. In addition to this, if you are standing within 10 yards of a box, the box will glow red, making it unable to protect you from Venting Flames. If the box ever turns red because of this, your party will wipe. It's for this reason, you'll always want to stay away from the boxes until the boss casts Explosive Leap. He will always cast this once before he casts Venting Flames. And finally, the boss casts Blazing Chomp, applying a significant burn on your tank. The damage over time component of this is deadly. Healers, you must dispel this as soon as you can. Upon dispelling it, it does damage to the entire party. However, at the moment of writing this guide, the group-wide damage does not seem to scale with key level. I'll post in the comments when they fix this. And that's the whole fight. You then make your way up the Conveyor Belt with flamethrowers all along the belt. Warlocks can use a gate here to teleport the party forward, skipping a good portion of it. Otherwise, Demon Hunters can also double jump their way up. At the end of the belt is a button which can be pressed to disable the flamethrowers, making the lives of your party members much easier. After you make your way to the top, you enter an arena-like area. Here you'll face 3 waves of enemies. In the corner here there is also a Workshop Defender that is actually a Nathrezim. You'll want to pull him with one of the packs to AoE down quickly. You shouldn't aggro the citizens as they are not worth count. The first wave consists of 2 Tinkerers and 2 Guard Dogs. The Tinkerers are a rather dangerous enemy, with their main ability, Giga Wallop. After a 3-second cast, they strike a player with lightning that bounces to additional players. You'll want to interrupt this as much as you can, to reduce incoming group damage. It does a lot of damage. The Tinkerers also cast Anti-Personnel Squirrel, sending one out which usually walks over to a ranged DPS. Once the squirrels have found their ideal position, they begin to self-destruct. You'll want to step away from these circles. The Guard is comparatively harmless, with their main ability being Metallic Jaws, dealing physical damage to your tank. If your group is good on interrupts, pulling the Nathrezim here is a good idea. Wave 2 has 2 Defense Bot Mark 1s and 1 Defense Bot Mark 3. Defense Bot Mark 1's main ability and only ability is Arcing Zap, an ability with a very short cast time that applies a magic dot to a random player in your party. This dot stacks and is cast by the defense bot frequently. There will be a large amount of group-wide damage going out because of this, as your healer can only dispel one of these dots at a time. The Defense Bot Mark 3 also casts 2 abilities in addition to Arcing Zap. The first is Defensive Countermeasure, where they grant themselves a relatively large shield. You'll want to dispel this. The other is Short Out, where they sit and cast for 3 seconds, dealing unavoidable damage to the entire party for that duration. You'll probably want to use a defensive here. There is a lot of effectively unavoidable damage here. If your group can handle that reasonably well, I find on lower keys it's easier to pull the Nathrezim here. And finally, Wave 3 consists of one Blastatron X80, a healthy mob with 3 abilities. The first is Sonic Pulse, where after a short cast, it'll shoot forward a bullet which silences any player's hit for 8 seconds. Make sure to avoid this to keep your DPS uptime high. They also cast Launch High Explosive Rockets, which launches rockets in many directions. Just avoid these circles. And finally, the Blastatron's most important ability, Capacitor Discharge, affectionately named Pizza Slice. The Blastatron will divide the area into 4. 3 of these 4 areas will be covered in a sea of blue, where after a few seconds, blue areas will explode, silencing, pacifying, and dealing damage to anyone caught in the area. The Blastatron will cast this 3 times, with a different safe zone for every cast. You'll want to ensure you're not hit by a single one of these explosions. The debuff is a magic debuff, so it can be dispelled should you miss the safe zone. A trick tanks can do is pull the Blastatron to one end of the area, as ranged DPS can outrange the Pizza Slice mechanic. After defeating the 3 waves, the following area is one of the hardest parts of the dungeon. You'll have to sneak by these robots and make it to the other side. Being within their detection radius will zap you, stunning you for 6 seconds and sending you back to the start. You'll want to carefully and patiently go through the gaps in their patrols. Standing in smoke vents will render you 100% immune to their detection. I'll show you which path you'll take most frequently, but it's slow and you'll need to be patient. This next pull is the second hardest pull in the entire dungeon. We've seen the Defense Bot Mark 1 and the Tinkerer, both dangerous in their own rights. In my opinion, the Tinkerer is the most dangerous mob in this pack. You might want to focus it. The Mark 1 is a close second in power level. As for the other mobs, the mechanic casts 2 abilities, Overclock and Tune Up. Overclock is a short interruptible cast, which increases the haste of all robots nearby by 100%. You'll want to interrupt this as a priority. They also cast Tune Up, healing 10% of a targeted enemy's health every 2 seconds for 8 seconds. It's also quite important to interrupt. The defenders aren't very threatening. They only cast Chain Blade, applying a bleed to your tank. Nothing to look at here. However, throughout this encounter, the defenders also occasionally spawn a shield generator. That shield generator perpetually casts Shield Generator, generating a small radius, which grants all characters in it a 75% damage reduction, friend or foe. You'll want to stand on this to minimize incoming damage from the Defense Bot and the Tinkerer. Outside of significantly high keys, you should be safe to stand in these generators to survive explosive squirrels. Just be careful for when the shields time out exactly as the squirrels blow up. After defeating this pack, you face the third boss, Head Machinist Sparkflux. It's a very chaotic fight, and the fight's mechanics occur more frequently the longer the fight goes on. Let's talk about the arena first. The fight starts with the arena spawning a few cogs which bounce around the room infinitely, called Self-Trimming Hedge. These do a great amount of damage, so you'll want to be mindful of your position to not get hit by one of these. As the fight progresses, more cogs will spawn, making it harder for casters to cast their abilities. The arena will also continuously pelt the arena and fire explosions. You'll just want to step out of these AoEs. More of these spawn as the fight progresses. As for the boss himself, at around 80% energy, the boss will spawn an inconspicuous plant. The plant will immediately lock onto the nearest player and pelt that player with Blossom Blasts. The healer will need to watch out for this and pump that target with heals. He will repeat this every time he reaches around 80% energy. Upon reaching 100 energy, the boss will cast Hidden Flame Cannon, where at the center of the arena, 3 spouts will form that shoot out a beam of fire after a few seconds. These then immediately turn either clockwise or counterclockwise. Getting hit by any of these beams will apply a dot on you that deals a significant amount of damage. You'll want to move with the lasers, all while still DPSing the boss. The boss also occasionally casts, sometimes after flamethrowers have stopped, Discombomb you later, which is just a large blue circle which disorients you if you're hit by it. Keep a lookout for it and avoid it, especially tanks. And that's the fight. Should the fight last more than around 2 minutes 30 seconds or 3 minutes, the fight becomes unbelievably chaotic. so that's about the goal you want to set yourself for this boss. After defeating the boss, you make your way up a ramp and face 2 spider tanks. Normally you pull them together as they aren't very threatening. These spider tanks are identical to the X80 mob seen in the 3 waves earlier on the 3rd wave. The only difference is they don't cast Pizza Slice. As a recap, the spider tanks will cast Sonic Pulse, silencing and a piercing bolt in front of it, and launch high explosive rockets, firing wildly around the area. Avoid these circles. Upon defeating these spiders, you'll take a chopper and make your way to the final climb to the boss. There's a small 3-pack at the foot of the ramp, 2 defenders and a tinkerer. As a recap, defenders bleed your tank, and tinkerers spam Giga Wallop and spawn squirrels to bomb players. In the middle of the ramp are 2 defense bot Mark IIIs. As a reminder, these defense bots frequently apply the magic debuff Arcing Zap to your party. They cast defensive countermeasure on themselves, and cast Short Out, dealing unavoidable damage to the entire party. Just like with the pack before the 3rd boss, each defender spawns shield generators that grant all characters a 75% DR. Tanks should pull the mobs out of these shields, and players should stand in the shields to reduce damage from Short Out. The pack that follows after that is the hardest pack of the entire dungeon. The existence of 2 defense bot Mark IIIs make it significantly difficult due to their significant damage output. There is also 1 mechanic, 1 tinkerer, and 1 defender. Lots of pain points where the pull can go south. Due to the linear nature of Workshop, you actually don't need this pack for count. There are several ways you can skip this. The first and easiest option is using a Warlock portal. The second is where the tank holds the pack here, and the healer goes through and disengages through Shadow Meld, or optionally, the tank B-reses the healer after the healer dies. If all of this seems too convoluted, that's fine. It's always an option to just pull the pack. But know that this pack can be a source of several deaths if not careful. And now we enter the final boss fight, King Mechagon himself. The fight consists of 3 parts. The first is where you face King Mechagon in his aerial unit R21X. The fight begins with King Mechagon spawning 4 plasma orbs. Walking into these plasma orbs knocks you back and deals good damage. Avoid these. The boss casts Recalibrate, moving these plasma orbs. They're telegraphed with bright blue circles. Avoid these. Note that collision with these plasma orbs is possible, so beware of their travel paths. The boss himself casts Pulse Blast at the tank. It's a ranged ability, but if the tank is relatively close to the boss will walk over to melee range of the tank. Standing too far away will cause the boss to cast at range, which isn't preferable, as you'll want to reposition the boss a few times in this first part. The boss then casts Giga Zap, a long cast on a single player. That player will want to stand still, and everyone else moves around that player. Then Giga Zap deals significant damage to that player, and applies a reasonable dot on that player. If multiple players are hit by this beam, you are taking a fair amount of unnecessary damage. Finally, in the first phase, the boss occasionally casts Blast Off, following up with a cutting beam. He launches into the air, and a beam starts shooting from below. He will then begin to chase a random player. Standing on that laser will deal lethal damage to that player. Whoever this targets will want to kite this ability. The boss can still be damaged while he's midair, so try your best to still do damage. Just don't be under the beam. This beam does negligible unavoidable damage to all players. After defeating the aerial unit, the boss stuns all players for 8 seconds through obnoxious monologue. The boss will then enter his Omega Buster and begin to use a set of mostly familiar abilities. The boss still casts Recalibrate in this armor, so beware of the plasma orbs around the room. The boss also casts a new Giga Zap. The beam is much wider, and he shoots 3 in rapid succession at 3 random players. You take significantly more damage from subsequent applications of Giga Zap, so it is very important not to get hit by a beam unnecessarily. In this second part of the fight, the tank must now remain within melee range of the boss for the whole fight, or the boss will cast Protocol 99, dealing significant damage to the whole party. His new ability is Magneto Arm, spawning a magnet which draws all players and plasma orbs into it. Should you touch the magnet, you die. Should you collide with multiple plasma orbs on the way to the magnet, you die. This magnet also does unavoidable damage to the entire party. The closer you are to the magnet, the more damage you take, so try to be as far away from the magnet as possible. Upon defeating the Omega Buster, the boss exits the suit and parachutes slowly to the ground. This is your victory lap. The boss has no mechanics here. Kill him, and you've completed the dungeon. And that's it. It's a linear dungeon with difficult bosses. I know it can be intimidating playing Mythic Plus, especially if you aren't caught up with all the dungeon mechanics. I hope this video taught you something new about Mechagon Workshop. I plan on making a guide for all other Season 4 dungeons too, so be sure to subscribe if you want to catch those. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next dungeon guide.